Welcome back to the Wild Files. I'm Jane Matthews, founder of Wildcat Careers, where we work exclusively with MSPs to fix broken hiring processes, create cultures people actually want to work in, and build teams that succeed. And this is the Wild Files, the podcast where we stop talking about hiring like it sits in a neat little HR box and we start talking about it for what it really is inside an MSP. A growth issue, a delivery issue, a leadership issue, and quite often a profitability issue as well. This month we've been digging into the reality of hiring pressure inside growing MSPs. Not the surface level version, not the tidy version, the real version. The version that shows up in stretched teams, delayed decisions, and reactive leadership. And also that low-level feeling that everything is taking more effort than it should. And today we're talking about the true cost of slow hiring. Not the admin inconvenience, not the diary reshuffle, not the arrogance of trying to coordinate interviews. The deeper cost. The cost that sits underneath the surface and changes how growth feels inside the business. Because one of the biggest mistakes MSPs make is thinking slow hiring is just a recruitment delay. It isn't. It changes utilization. It changes leadership behavior. It changes how confidently you can say yes to new work. It changes how much strain your team, your existing team carries while everyone is trying to keep things moving. And the tricky bit is this. Slow hiring rarely feels like a dramatic problem. It arrives quietly. It feels like waiting a few more weeks. It feels like being cautious. It feels like wanting to be more certain before committing to another salary. It feels responsible. Until eventually the whole business starts feeling heavier than it should. You're still moving. You're still growing. You're still delivering. But it feels harder. It feels more strained. It feels more effort. And that's why I want to start with an analogy, because sometimes the clearest way to understand what's happening in a business is to compare it to something physical that you can actually feel. So I want you to imagine you're driving a powerful car up a long open road. The engine's strong, the route's clear. Their destination is exciting. Everything about that car says it should move smoothly and confidently. But the handbrake is not fully released, not slammed on, not enough to stop the car, just slightly engaged. So the car still moves forward. You can still accelerate. You can still make progress. You can still get to where you're going. But the journey feels heavier than it should because the engine has to work harder. You have to press the accelerator more. There's more drag, more resistance, more effort than there needs to be. That is what slow hiring does to a growing MSP. Commercial demand is the engine, leadership ambition is the steering, service delivery is the road you are trying to navigate, and hiring pace is the handbrake. When hiring rhythm lags behind growth, the business still moves. That is what makes this so deceptive. It looks like failure. Well, it doesn't, in fact. It doesn't look like failure. It looks like progress with strain. And because you're still moving, it's easy to miss what is actually causing the pressure. You assume growth is supposed to feel like this. You assume scaling is just hard. You assume the team needs to dig a little deeper. When sometimes the truth is much, much simpler. The handbrake's still on. And unless you recognise that, the default response is to press harder on the accelerator, which means more pressure on the team, more leadership involvement, more firefighting, more wear and tear across the business, all while the real issue remains untouched. That is why slow hiring is so dangerous, because it disguises itself as normal growth pressure, when actually it's preventable operational drag. So this is how it usually starts, not with bold decisions to delay hiring, not with the leadership team sitting around saying, let's understaff the business and see what happens. It starts with good intentions. We'll recruit soon. Let's just get through this month first. Let's wait until the revenue is a little bit more settled. Let's make sure the timing is right. And to be fair, that sounds sensible, right? Because most MSP leaders are not careless. They are trying to balance margins, headcount, delivery pressure, and risk. They are trying to make sound decisions. They're trying not to overhire too early. That is responsible leadership. But there is a subtle trap hidden inside that phrase soon. Soon stretches. Soon becomes a few weeks, that become a few months. A month becomes another quarter. And by the time hiring becomes urgent, the organisation has already spent weeks or months absorbing unnecessary pressure. And this is where another analogy helps, because slow hiring is a bit like noticing a leak in the ceiling and deciding to place a bucket underneath it rather than actually fixing the roof. At first, it feels manageable because the bucket catches the drip. The room still functions, the house still stands. So you tell yourself it's under control. But over time, the bucket fills, the drip continues, and the damage spreads. And what could have been sorted earlier becomes a bigger problem to fix later. That is what happens when an MSP delays hiring too long. The team becomes the bucket. Senior engineers carry more escalations. Team leaders spend less time leading and more time covering. Directors become operational shock absorbers instead of strategic leaders. And because everyone is keeping things going, the business convinces itself it's coping. But coping is not the same as scaling well. And that is the hidden cost of we'll recruit soon. It rarely feels like one big bad decision. It feels like manageable, postponement until the accumulation starts to show. Let's keep building this properly, because another thing slow hiring changes is how you experience opportunity. When an MSP is properly resourced, growth feels exciting. A new client comes in and leadership thinks, brilliant, let's go. A strategic partnership appears and the mindset is, yes, we can support that. A project lands and the team has enough capacity to absorb it without everything wobbling. But when hiring is lagging, opportunity starts to feel different. And this is where I often think about it like a restaurant in the middle of a busy service. If the kitchen is fully staffed, a full restaurant is a good sign. It's busy, yes. But is it profitable busy? Controlled busy? The kind of busy that tells you the operation is working. But if the kitchen is already short-staffed and bookings keep coming in, the exact same full restaurant starts to feel pretty stressful. Now, every new table is not just revenue, it's pressure, it is risk. And another demand on the system that's already stretched. And the opportunity has not changed. The internal capacity has. And that's exactly what happens inside a scaling MSP. New opportunities should feel energizing. But when recruitment pipelines are weak or delayed, partners start responding to growth with caution rather than confidence. Not because they are negative, not because they lack ambition, but because they do not fully trust the current delivery capacity to carry it well. That is a huge shift, because once growth starts to feel threatening rather than exciting, leadership behaviour tends to change. You hesitate more, you hold back more, you analyse more, you become more conservative in decisions that in a better resourced environment would feel straightforward. So yes, growth opportunity absolutely has a shelf life. But the bigger point is this: slow hiring shortens the window in which you can confidently act on it. Let's talk about what this does to leaders, because one of the least visible impacts on slow hiring is mental load. When business is slightly under capacity, leaders start operating like, air traffic controllers. Every moving part matters, every delay matters, every unexpected absence matters. You're constantly scanning. Who is overloaded? Where are the weak points? What happens if one more thing lands? Can the team absorb another project? How close are we to service issues? And again, that does not always look dramatic from the outside. Externally, you still look composed. The business still looks functional. Clients may not see the internal calculations at all. But internally, your brain is burning energy all day, just trying to keep the aircrafts from colliding. And that matters because that mental energy could have been spent somewhere else, on innovation, on leadership development, on commercial strategy, on improving services, on thinking ahead. Slow hiring does not just delay operational capacity, it consumes leadership creativity. And that is such an important point because MSP founders and directors often assume they are tired because growth is demanding. But sometimes they are tired because they are carrying capacity problems that should have been solved structurally, not personally. Now let's move into client experience. Because when people hear slow hiring, well, they often picture internal inconvenience. What they do not always picture is the external ripple. And it's a ripple, not usually a crash. This is not normally a sudden catastrophe, an awful failure where everything falls apart on one terrible Tuesday afternoon. It's more like turning the temperature up 1 degree at a time. At first, nobody reacts, then gradually things feel different. Response times stretch a little. Engineers have less breathing room. Proactive recommendations become less frequent. Strategic conversations become more reactive, and projects take longer to move. Clients might not articulate it perfectly, but they feel it. They can sense when their MSP is operating from a calm capacity versus operating from pressure. And this is where the domino effect matters. A small hiring delay creates a capacity gap. The capacity gap creates team strain. The team strain that reduces productivity and proactivity. And reduced proactivity affects client experience. Client experience shapes retention, referrals, and reputation. So when we say slow hiring affects growth, this is what we mean. Not just because it delays a person joining, but because it gradually changes the quality and confidence of the service experience around them. And then there is culture. At first, pressure can feel quite unifying. The team starts to rally, people pull together, there is a sense of momentum. Everybody knows it's a busy patch and they push through. That can work for a while, sure. But if the understaffing drags on too long, the story, well, that changes. We're busy because we're growing becomes we're always stretched. That is a cultural turning point because growth pressure feels purposeful. Permanent pressure feels, well, draining. And this is where another analogy fits. I love an analogy. I don't know if you've noticed. Think of it like carrying a heavy backpack. If you're hiking up a hill and you know there is a point where you can put the bag down, you cope well. The effort feels, well, temporary. You can endure it because there is relief visible. But if you start to suspect that this bag is never coming off, your relationship with the weight changes completely. And that is what teams feel in an understaffed MSP. People can tolerate challenge. They can tolerate busy periods. They can tolerate hard work. What they struggle with is the feeling that the load is becoming permanent. And when that happens, resilience starts turning into endurance. Endurance can keep a business running for a while, but it's not a great foundation for retention, innovation, or energy. Great engineers do not mind being challenged. They love it. They just do not want to live in survival mode forever. This is why I think MSP leaders need to reframe hiring entirely. It's not a cost line. It's not an admin process, not as something that you deal with once service pain becomes obvious, but as strategic agility. Because this, that is really what good hiring rhythm gives you. It gives you room, and room says yes to growth, room to protect service quality, room to develop leaders properly, room to avoid over-relying on heroics from your best people. And that matters because a lot of MSPs are not actually short on ambition. They're short on capacity, confidence. And those are very different things. When hiring is proactive and intentional, leaders can move with what I call far more freedom. They can act before pressure gets damaging. They can grow without making every decision feel like a risk assessment. They can build a business that feels scalable rather than one that only grows by squeezing more from the same people. And that, my friends, is a strategic reframe. Hiring is not just about filling roles. It's about protecting future possibility. So if growth currently feels heavier than you expected, it's worth asking a better question. Not just, oh, it's the market right now. Not just, why does everything feel a bit stretched? Ask instead, are we trying to scale with hiring? Ask instead, are we trying to scale with a hiring handbrake still partially on? Because if you are, that would explain a lot. Why growth feels harder earned, why leadership feels more reactive, why the team feels stretched even while the business is succeeding, why opportunities feel slightly more stressful than exciting. Slow hiring does not always stop progress. It just changes experience of progress. It makes success noisier, heavier, more dependent on people digging deep rather than systems working properly. And the MSPs that scale best are not always the luckiest. Often they are simply the ones that recognized earlier that people capacity is not a support function. It is, in fact, growth infrastructure. So as you look ahead to your next phase of expansion, ask yourself honestly, are we driving forward freely, or are we asking the business to accelerate while the handbrake is still dragging in the background? Because sustainable growth is not just winning more work. It's about building the team infrastructure that allows growth to feel controlled when it arrives. If this episode sparks something for you, share it with another MSP leader who is trying to grow but quietly crushing their team in the process. Because sometimes what looks like a hiring issue is actually a business design issue. And once you see that properly, you can do something about it. So here's where I'll leave you. Growth doesn't need more effort. It needs better alignment. Stay intentional with your hiring, staying structured with your decisions, and don't let hidden friction dictate how far you can go. And as always, stay wild.